Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is John Arrett. He is Vice President of Strategy and Risk for Risk Recon, a MasterCard company. John, good to have you with us.
Good to be here, Tom. Thank you.
And our topic is supply chain risk management, supply chain risk mitigation when it comes to software, a big issue for the federal government, a big issue for really everybody. But as the biggest software buyer, the government has the most at stake here. And we should really begin with Executive Order 14028. A couple of years old nearly now, but enhancing software supply chain security was specifically called out in that. And let's begin with your best general advice for agencies trying to make sure that they're good with enhancing software supply chain security.
I think at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is gaining situational awareness of that software supply chain, right? And maybe that's sometimes easier said than done. In the security world, we have the idea of trust but verify. And I think when it comes to stuff like the software supply chain, we do an awful lot of trusting and not much verifying, right? It's different than the other stuff where we do full-blown audits and all that sort of stuff. We've just kind of accepted it as it is, and oftentimes installed things and that sort of stuff. But obviously, we can't go down that path anymore. As far as strategies, obviously, the use of software bill of materials to understand what makes up all the components of your software, and then from there, I think we can actually kind of go back to the way we kind of rely on and use tools in the traditional third-party risk world, not just focusing specifically on software, but once you know what makes up that software, the different components of it, who those suppliers are, then you can start to take a look at those companies themselves and kind of gain a sense for what their hygiene looks like, right? You can try to do assurance work. You can use continuous monitoring tools to assess those organizations. And at the end of the day, we really have to make that determination of, can they be trusted for what they're providing to us? Do they take security seriously enough that we don't have those concerns that when we're putting something on our network to run that it's going to be as advertised, right? It's not going to be something that we expect one thing and we get something else, right? So I think that's from a basic strategic standpoint. How do we tackle 14028? It's really about gaining that situational awareness and then kind of using the tools that we've already had at our disposal to assess traditional vendor relationships. And once you understand that software bill of materials, start to tackle it much the same way.
Yeah, the idea of third-party risk management is fairly common in industry for everything else people buy or deal with. And so therefore, the implication is you have to stop thinking of software as like a gallon of milk. But in fact, it's many, many, many components, just like a vehicle is or something.
Absolutely. And absolutely. And in the past, many people that were already performing third-party risk management oftentimes left out those software suppliers, right? Because you weren't giving them data. You weren't giving them access to systems in many cases. So they were left out of the equation and just basically left to be an internal risk. But I think, the way the world's changed and especially through the executive order, we can't think of it that way anymore. We have to start to be more proactive and, there's challenges that come along with that, but hopefully we'll find ways to tackle all of that.
Yeah. And so what do you ask of your suppliers? How do you get started with this? How do you get good with the executive order, but even more important, get good with actual supply chain security in the software supply chain?
Right. If you're good with the supply chain security, then you can kind of use those lessons learned to then do what you need to from the software supply chain piece.
Right. So there's best practices from third-party risk management as a practice that you simply need to make sure you extend to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The challenge there is most third-party risk programs tend to be a little bit resource constrained, and now we're going to ask them to take that multiple steps further and start looking at the software piece of that, and that's where different tools and not just solely relying on the human that really comes into play.
And software has a lot of qualities that we care about. Reliability. Does it do what it's supposed to do? Does it operate in a way that protects us from outages and, the need to invoke, continuity of operation.
Absolutely.
But let me ask from a national security perspective, does that come into this? Does it rise to that level, do you think?
Yeah, I think it does. If in the traditional non-federal world, right? If I'm talking regular corporate America, we are concerned with kind of, are my investments worth it or not? Am I pouring money into the right place? And that's really kind of the same thing, but in the federal world, we're looking at it more from a national security standpoint, and it's not so much about did I put the right money in the right bucket, right? We want to protect the national security. And really at the end of the day, vendors, suppliers, software suppliers, they're really all agencies' new perimeter, right? We spend a lot of time, money, and effort to secure agencies, much the same way we secure corporate environments. We put firewalls and all these sorts of rules in place. But then we install software from a third party. We send data out to a different third party, right, to perform services for us. And if any one of those is the weak link, all the money we spent, the time and effort to secure that internal network that we cared so much about is really for naught, right? So in the case of the federal world, it becomes even more different because that could be a national security issue. It's not so much, hey, my banking details were exposed, something like that. It could be something that actually has an impact on the national security of the country. Something like another SolarWinds through the software supply chain could lead to a breach of critical government systems by nation states, right? Critical infrastructure shut down. When that happens, then we start to see basic necessities that get hampered and the destabilization potentially of the government, right? We saw the Colonial Pipeline, which is sort of a different spin on this, was really a ransomware event. But think if something like that happened, in the federal chain, and something was completely shut down, what that effect had. With the Colonial Pipeline, we saw gas pipelines and gas shortages in the Southeast. But if that happened, in the federal network, there could be some major implications for the country as a whole. And if we're talking about a traditional vendor where maybe they have government data, like something like the Department of Defense, who relies on countless third parties. That's why we have the CMMC thing that's been put forth. They're relying on those things to help produce warfighting equipment. And what happens if that data gets exposed and suddenly, nation states have access to secrets that we don't want them to? If you ever look at the Chinese stealth fighter, it looks an awful lot like the stealth fighters that we have, maybe just different paint job. And that's the sort of thing that's a real world national security implication of supplier and even software supplier risk.
Sure. Yeah. They added an engine, but otherwise it's pretty much the same.
A red star and an engine, and it's like the same thing, right?
But what you say when you mention SolarWinds brings up an important point, and that is not only is it important that the components that are going into your software build, your bill of materials, are themselves secure, but that vendor itself is secure in its own
100%.
Supply chain.
100%, right? Because that if you can't trust that vendor to be secure, to take care of the source code that maybe they're using to build their application, you can't trust that application any longer, right? In the past, we wouldn't have thought twice. We would have just put it on the network, and now we have to ask those hard questions.
Right. It's almost like a chef. You want to make sure his or her hands are totally clean, but you also want to make sure the lettuce is clean because you know where it came from.
Yeah, and you kind of think, like I have kids with allergies and with food allergies, and you kind of have to be that person now that says, well, what's in this? Did not only is there peanuts in this, but did you cut peanuts with a knife that you're using to make my meal? Like you have to know everything about what's going into it. That's the world we live in now, unfortunately.
And for the most part, it's a matter of self-attestation on the part of the software vendors nowadays for agencies to be able to get at least that far in saying, people saying, yes, this is safe. I'm not sure who would tell them, no, this is not safe, but here, go ahead and buy it. But
not anybody from a marketing department that's worth anything, right?
Right. So how do you verify these claims? And, is there a way in which they can be trusted depending on the vendor?
Self-attestations are a necessary evil in this environment, right? It's kind of the way things work, but can we trust them? Yes and no, right? I've filled out these sorts of attestations before. You tend to want to paint a really rosy picture of everything that's going on. So maybe you cherry pick evidence and that sort of stuff. So, in short, can we fully trust them? No, we actually did a study here at Risk Recon talking to third-party risk programs and asked them if they felt that self-attestation security questionnaires were accurate in depicting the effectiveness of controls in an organization. Only 34% said yes, right? So that should tell you something. As far as how do we tackle that, I think you got to utilize a vast number of tools, and it doesn't have to be, maybe not vast is the wrong word, maybe a subset of tools, not just one single tool. And the single tool in my mind is just the attestation. Are you doing this? Yes or no? People take it as gospel, but I think you have to validate that, right? If you're talking to an organization and you're asking them, do they patch their systems? If they say yes, they might give you a copy of a patching policy and a screenshot. you have to determine if that's an effective control on a really small subset of information that could have massive real world implications. So I think in that regard, I tend to advise people, if you're building a program that's going to do traditional third party risk, that's going to look at software supply chain risk, build it like a Swiss Army knife, right? You're going to have a couple different tools at your disposal. It's going to be a combination of that self attestation, something that can help validate the attestation. Things like continuous monitoring tools, which are going to tell you if the hygiene from the outside matches what they're telling you on the questionnaire. If they say they're doing patching, are they really doing patching? What does it look like? So I think we, while they're great and they're a necessary evil and they'll probably never go away, the attestation is only as good sometimes as the paper that it's printed on, unfortunately. And I know the people filling them out, for them, that they don't want to hear that answer, but unfortunately, we can't live in the world where we're doing much the same we were with software before, that small amount of verifying and a lot of trusting. We have to do an equal mix.
And to be fair, I mean, software companies might believe their own self-attestation, but they themselves may not be totally aware of their own vulnerabilities. So that's why you need to get into that whole verification business.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, we're going to get into more of that in detail, but first we're going to take a short break. My guest today is John Arrett. He's the Vice President of Strategy and Risk for Risk Recon, a MasterCard company. I'm Tom Temin on Federal Insights, measuring cyber risk in your digital supply chain, sponsored by Risk Recon here on Federal News Network.